I am Reverend Najuma Smith-Pollard. I'm the program manager at the Cecil Murray Center for Community Engagement. And we welcome you to USC Dornsife School of Center for Religion and Civic Culture to our critical conversation. Today's critical conversation is around election dissection. November 2020 was the presidential election that marked the end of the Trump presidency. The election also revealed new shifts in the way that America votes and self-identity in the electoral politics. So that's what we'll be talking about today with our guest panelists. And just grateful to have all these wonderful people joining us. When we began Critical Conversations in 2020, we thought it was crucial to continue the conversation into 2021. And so here we have a few of our prompts, what we've asked our panelists to respond to. The first question, or giving thought, what they'll give thought to when each of them offers their reflections this morning, is what are some of the most important or significant shifts you saw in the way communities voted in the 2020 election? They've also been asked, what do you attribute these changes to? And what are some things that did not change in the way people voted in the 2020 election? And so we're looking forward to hearing from each of our guests as they share their reflections on these prompts right here in relationship to the 2020 election. Let's first introduce Dr. Youssef Chaoud. Dr. Chaoud, we welcome you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here this morning. Let me get this up and running and get started. All right, welcome everybody. As was mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about American Muslims. And as you may have noticed, I have a bit of a cheeky subtitle there. Muslim voters, also not a monolith, and this is an allusion to this strange phenomenon that took place after the election, where everybody began to realize, like, oh look, all these minorities, wait, they don't vote like an undifferentiated unit. So Muslims were among these minorities that people realize were, oh, look at that, there's some diversity there. Now, listen, I'm being a little cheeky, but I realize that there is a sense that why wouldn't Muslims vote, perhaps not uniformly, but by and large in a particular direction for a particular candidate? And that's because we've all been around in the past 4 years. We know the kind of animus that has been leveled against American Muslims. We don't have to kind of go through it in detail, but suffice it to say that an already fraught socio-political environment was made all the more fraught, or the more perilous once Donald Trump entered the scene. These are FBI statistics of anti-Muslim assaults, which are almost assuredly undercounting the actual threat that American Muslims faced. But of course, as I mentioned, this was an already fraught socio-political environment. As my colleague Nazir al-Ishbari at Michigan State University has shown, the negative sentiment that Americans were exposed to whenever they would, tune into really across the board broadcast that mentioned Muslims or Muslim Americans, was very kind of keen, very, very kind of uniform in that post 9/11 era, right? And so what Donald Trump really kind of did is kind of tap that reservoir of negative sentiment. He didn't kind of create something de novo. And if we want to kind of really push the metaphor a little bit, perhaps it wasn't so much tapping the reservoir as kind of opening the floodgates. So not surprisingly, when you actually look at the data of how American Muslims kind of viewed Donald Trump in the 2016 election, Pew found that only 8% reported voting for Donald Trump. When ISPU earlier in 2016, before the election, asked a full sample of American Muslims, so voters, non-voters, citizens, non-citizens, who they wanted to actually end up winning the election, 15% would say that they wanted Donald Trump to win. So perhaps this is something of a ceiling then, we would imagine. And indeed, when 2020 rolled around and the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding fielded their poll in early 2020, they found that 14% wanted Donald Trump reelected. But if you notice, this was fielded in early 2020. A whole heck of a lot was going to happen later on in 2020, right? So a lot of social and political upheaval. And as it turned out, when we actually got closer to the election, this tally actually ticked up a little bit. The Council on American Islamic Relations found that 18% voted for Trump in their poll fielded shortly before the election. And the Cooperative Election Study found that 22% voted or planned to vote for Donald Trump. And then the real big surprise came about. The AP's VoteCast found that 35% of American Muslims say they voted for Donald Trump. So how do we make sense of this finding? I mean, if you would ask me, I'd say the most valid range is probably somewhere between 25 and 30%, but that's still probably a lot larger than you would imagine it being. So what do we turn to? How do we explain how Muslims were voting? Well, the first thing to note is that, as my cheeky subtitle alluded to, this is a very diverse community. And in fact, the most diverse major religious community that we have in America. This is yes, a lot of Arabs, a lot of South Asians, as we kind of, instinctively think of Muslims as being, but, a lot of African Americans as well. Hispanic American Muslims are, the largest growing segment of the American Muslim community. And, it might surprise a lot of people to find out that, yes, there are quite a few white Americans that are Muslim as well. And at a time when racial and ethnic backgrounds condition a lot of social and political attitudes, this is an important finding. And indeed, when you break voting preferences, when you break political preferences down by racial and ethnic background, you find that, well, white American Muslims are not too different from white Americans in the general public, according to the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding's latest survey. And so this kind of gets us, perhaps a bit closer then to kind of wrapping our heads around this high tally of, Trump support that we found following the November election. Another point to note, though, is that, this might be just simply a return back to a mean reversion, right? To use the social scientific parlance. And indeed, we see that, each year kind of leading up to 2020, it was, the percentage, the proportion of American Muslims that affirmatively claimed to be Republican was right around that same range, but then kind of ticked up precipitously, or notably, in 2020. And the reason that I say this might be something of a mean reversion is because the only time we can really talk about a Muslim bloc vote was in the year 2000, when Muslims by and large voted for George W. Bush. I'm sure this might be a surprise to a lot of folks in the audience, unfamiliar with American Muslim political history. But when you kind of dig into what Muslims believe a little bit, you see that it's not too kind of anachronistic. In fact, Muslims have a lot of kind of heterodox positions relative to Democrats more broadly. Yes, they are by and large Democrat, but they're not kind of fully bought into the Democratic agenda, right? Wholesale. There are very kind of notable differences on particularly socially conservative areas, right? With regards to abortion, or, with regards to, more, kind of what you would code as perhaps red state issues, right? Corporate tax rates, assault rifles, right? So there's a bit of heterogeneity there. But that's not to say that this is all settled. The last point that I want to make is that a lot of it is really not settled. And so perhaps it's just a matter of kind of helping Muslims kind of make the connection, or trying to see, do Muslims actually see themselves as part of a larger kind of minority cohort in the United States? And certainly there's evidence to suggest that at least the non-minority, the majority kind of seems to lump them in a lot of the same categories as other minorities. And, you know, ISPU found that, for example, when legislators put forth anti-Sharia or anti-foreign law bills, they very much, you know, often, you know, pose restrictive bills towards other minorities as well. So that's one thing. So perhaps, you know, just kind of helping Muslims kind of make those connections, that still is some work that needs to be done. But the other point to emphasize here in terms of things not quite being so settled is that there's this generational shift, right? Where on a lot of, you know, very notable social and political attitudes, you see that younger Muslims vary differently from older Muslims. So this is, you know, something to kind of keep an eye on as we go forward. And so, you know, just three main takeaways then. When you talk about the Muslim American electorate, it is, yes, the most diverse, and that is notable because, you know, as I mentioned, you know, you have these racial and political attitudes kind of conditioning, you know, how you feel about the world. But, you know, it's also geographic diversity as well. So Muslims in the Midwest are not going to act the same as Muslims, you know, in other parts of the country. I can go into that a little bit more in the Q&A if anyone's interested. They're also ideologically heterodox. So there's no real true political home for American Muslims, you know, as they, you know, kind of see themselves and the attitudes that they, you know, put forth and the attitudes that they believe, you know, the certain camps, you know, hold. And then lastly, you know, they are the youngest major religious community. So if we are to kind of talk about a coherent Muslim vote, you know, honestly, and perhaps, you know, this isn't exactly where we want to end, but honestly, it's just one big TBD, right? This is still a very nascent political community, and there is much change on the horizon. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Yusuf. Really great conversation and some wonderful pieces there. Next up, we will have Ms. Janelle Wong. Janelle, we welcome you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Yusuf, for that wonderful presentation. Obviously, a lot of Asian Americans are also Muslim, and so there's so much overlap here. I am going to, though, focus on the immigrant vote through the lens of Asian Americans. And I do this because, as most of you know, Asian Americans are a majority immigrant community, and other groups in the US listed here, including Latinx, are a minority immigrant community. So I think this is an interesting way to view the immigrant community. You can see here that today's immigrant vote is largely Asian American and Latinx, and in California, largely Asian American. And so these are some data from AAPI data. Many of you know Karthik Ramakrishnan, who is the head of this organization. And you can see where Asian Americans in 2020 were poised to make a difference. And you can see the population share of the electorate that is Asian American. You can see growing numbers in a lot of these swing states. There was a lot of excitement about this, especially when Tom Bonier released these analyses. He is the, he does a collection of registered voters and really took a close look at Asian American turnout. And you can see the Asian American community really came out. There was a surge in swing states, and we can see that in Georgia. Immigrants were really making, were really mobilized to come out, especially compared to Black and white voters. At the same time, when we're looking at immigrant voters, I think it's critical to understand these are relatively small groups in these swing states. And so even though there was this surge, these groups make up a relatively small population in these states. That said, of course, these are razor thin margins. And so immigrant voters can make a difference together in these states. So I wanted to just take a closer look at the Asian American vote here. What you see is that Trump was not a favorite among even the most Republican group, that's Vietnamese. But overall, there was a lot of lack of favorabilities. I think the most notable characteristic going into election 2020 among Asian Americans. These data are from the Asian American Voter Survey, which I helped conduct with Karthik Ramakrishnan also, just registered voters here. And it was done in language as well. And if you look at our estimate of the vote, we see that about a majority voted for Biden. This is in the summer, so there were still a lot of people who were still making up their minds, about 30% saying they would vote for Donald Trump. And that conformed pretty well to the exit polls. You saw about 30% hovering close, a little closer to 35 maybe, in the exit polls who said they were voting for Trump among Asian Americans. Of course, the exit polls have a major setback for gauging the Asian American vote, and that is they're done in English only. And so the majority of Asian Americans, of course, close to 70% of the electorate is foreign born. And so this is not a perfect gauge of the Asian American vote, but I'd like to see this kind of consistency. So what we saw in terms of shifts is that there was some shift to Trump. So about 30%, we estimate in 2020 versus 25% in 2016. The take home, I think, is that Asian American voters show unity over time. They have been one of the groups that has been moving most dramatically towards consistent support for the Democratic candidate. And in this case, we weren't surprised that they supported Biden, but we also see potential divisions in this slight growth in the Trump vote. And that is not just seen in surveys. We saw, and many of you saw these New York Times analyses that looked at immigrant neighborhoods, and we did see a shift. It's a little misleading because they didn't go Republican in these places necessarily, but we did see a change for a little bit more support for Donald Trump in a lot of immigrant areas using precinct level data. At the same time, there's been remarkable convergence across this very diverse population. So Asian American voters are healthcare voters, environmental voters. They are supporting gun control at higher rates than other Americans, and they support redistributive tax policies, even those with the highest income. And this, to me, is, the hallmark of the Asian American community is diversity, but we see these kind of issue convergences across party and across Asian national origins. So Vietnamese, who tend to be the most Republican group in the Asian American community, still show majority support for these sort of progressive policies. So let me just talk about why we're seeing some of the patterns we're seeing. And that is, these are speculation. We don't have great data, but we've seen, Donald Trump ushered in this environment of heightened racism and sexism that affects all communities, including Asian American communities. Asian American and Latinx registered voters were much less likely to be mobilized compared to white and Black voters because they're outside, for the most part, of the swing states. They're concentrated in these kind of safer states, safer blue places, and that included, and so Democrats also weren't doing as much mobilization. My personal critique is that the Democratic Party, while they did a lot on the ground, a lot of organizations did a good mobilization, as a whole, their strategies were obsessed with white rural voters and white suburban moms at, I think, the expense of immigrants. And so for the whole 4 years, they were talking about white rural voters and suburban moms and started to focus on immigrants very late in the campaign. And then Democrats themselves, I think, have been a little bit late to the party when it comes to religious voters. So Trump kicked off his campaign in January 2020 at a mega church, a Latinx mega church in Miami. The Koch brothers have been working on trying to recruit Latinx evangelicals for over 10 years. When did the Biden campaign launch its Latino evangelical outreach program? In mid-September 2020. And so, we get attention in the immigrant voting communities, really, I think, just in the few weeks before an election. That is too late, in my view. And so I don't have new data on this, but I'm happy to also talk about growing numbers of immigrant evangelicals and how they might have moved a little bit towards Trump, but I think these other explanations are just as powerful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Wong. This is awesome. And now we're going to move to discussing the Latino vote, and we're going to bring in Dr. Alexia Salvatore. And so welcome, Dr. Alexia.
Great to be with you this morning. So some of what I'm going to say is going to be interestingly repetitive, and some of it will be different. So I also have a cheeky little statement at the beginning: the Latino vote no existe, right? There isn't a Latino vote. If you can imagine the Tejano, the Texan Latino, whose family did not cross the border crossed them, and he works for the oil industry, in comparison to people who are asylum seekers, and then differentiating between people like Cubans or Venezuelans or Nicaraguans who were fleeing a country that was left, was communist or socialist, versus Salvadoreños and Guatemaltecos who were running away from a government that was to the right. So you can see that those people would have very different political perspectives. At the same time, there we go. At the same time, it is amazing that we can say some things about the Latino community that hold true, even with all of our differences. So before I talk about changes, I need to talk about long-term voting patterns. So since 1972, that's a long time ago, roughly 1/3 of the Hispanic community identifies as Republicans. And that, shifts in terms of what it looks like for presidential candidates. 2016, Trump got the lowest amount of any presidential candidate of the Hispanic community. He got 28%. And George Bush, in comparison, got 40%. Gabe Salguero calls us the quintessential swing voters. And I'm going to give you a little snapshot of what that means. My data all comes from PRRI or the Pew Research Centers or a couple of other additional surveys that have been done. Pew did a survey specifically on Hispanic evangelicals in 2007 as part of a larger survey. And what they found, just to give you a picture of what this means, is that 70%, and this is our most conservative community, like Janelle said the Vietnamese are, that 70% supported government engagement in health and social services, and 66% were willing to personally pay higher taxes to make that happen. 81% concerned about discrimination, but 77% believe that abortion should be illegal. So you can see why it doesn't fit, why our community doesn't fit neatly into one party or the other. These were the major political concerns of the Hispanic community in 2020. And in parentheses, you see the general population, and not in parentheses, you see the Latinx community. So economy, way up at the top, 80%, and of course, 79% of all Americans. There are big differences between women and men, that 59% of women are concerned not only about the economy, but about economic inequality, whereas only 45% of men are concerned about that. Health, 76% higher than the average American, which would be 68%. Climate change, 68%, interesting, in comparison to 42% in the average American. Racial inequality, 66% in comparison to 52%. Now, crime is higher than immigration. I want you to notice that. Crime, 64% in comparison to 62%. Immigration, 59% in comparison to 52%. But again, a big gender gap. Women at 69% and men at 50%. Abortion, 41% in comparison to 40%. But you also have a question there about the Supreme Court justice, and that was 64%. And for most Hispanics, that was an abortion question. What's interesting is when asked directly about how many of them were concerned about religious liberty and freedom of conscience, you get 80%, even though they don't list it as a major political concern. But you understand people are fleeing from countries where there was an identity between church and state or no allowance of church engagement. And so that's part of what you're seeing there. Changes in 2020. First of all, we had a big jump from 2000 to 2018, and actually all the way up to 2020 in the numbers of eligible voters. So we are at 13.3% right now of all eligible voters, which is larger than the African-American percentage. There are 61 million Hispanics, only about a third are immigrant, and most of us are English proficient. Every state in the country jumped, including a number of double-digit jumps. I mean, not double-digit, excuse me, multiplying 2 or 3 times as many. So we have states where it's a small percentage, but it's 2 or 3 times as much as it used to be. And in our swing states, there were major jumps. So Florida from 11 to 20%, Nevada from 10 to 20%, and Arizona, I can't see my screen, but you can see my screen. You can see how big the jump is. And we are also a population that skews young, and our young voters, as you've heard from the others, are much more progressive. 1 out of 5 Gen Z eligible voters are Latinx, and 74% of 18 through 29-year-olds supported Biden. There was a shift towards Trump, as you've heard from other people. He got 28% in the other presentations, right? That you heard, he got 28% in 2016 and 33% in 2020, 40% of Latinos in Florida and Texas. And that matches a statistic shortly before the election, which showed that 36% of Hispanics were generally approved of Trump's performance. So there are major religious differences between the Protestant or evangelical community and the Catholic community in the Latinx world. And I just need to say something very quickly about that, which is that the borders of these communities are very fuzzy. So the word in Latin America, Protestant or evangelical, are used interchangeably, even though there's a movement that we might call a great awakening going on throughout Latin America. That means greatly increased numbers of Protestants. They may be called Protestants or evangelicals. And many people go to evangelical prayer meeting on Wednesday night or healing service and Catholic church on Sunday morning. So these are very fungible, right? And they're not as big of a difference as people often think. We have right now in the US, 30% identify as Protestant or evangelical, 54% as Catholic. 40% is born again. So this movement is within the Catholic Church as well. I want to look at party affiliations. Catholics are 41% Democrat, 20% Independent, and 19% Republican. Look at Protestant evangelical. 28% Democrat, 31% Independent, and 32% Republican. So Pastor Jose Rivera of the Church of God of Prophecy, he's a bishop, and he says that he feels politically homeless. And I think that's what many people may feel. Immigration is very nuanced, and everyone needs to understand this, that 31% of Catholics and 45% of Protestant Latinx said that we wanted to stop refugees coming to this country. That's intense, right? But when we look at issues of family separation, 25% of Catholics accept that, 32% of Protestants. When we look at DACA, it's also about a 6 percentage point, 8 percentage point shift, not a lot of shift. There's a lot more concern about immigrant children than refugees, for example. Around discrimination and racial inequality, very high, consistent percentages of recognition that Black people are disadvantaged in this country. But 33% of Catholics and 50% of Protestant evangelicals think that police killings of Blacks are isolated incidents. So what are the implications in a nutshell? Well, I want to echo what my colleague said about the lack of attention. That 87% of whites were contacted at least once around the presidential election, only 75% of Hispanics. And of course, we were contacted very late. And in our community, that is particularly important because we are a relational community where loyalty matters. So the higher support for President Bush, George Bush, was because he actually really took time in the Latino community, and people believed that he cared. So it's not just whether you show up, it's whether people believe that you care, are in an ongoing relationship. Then I think it's really important. It may look very different that Hispanics are so anti-abortion, but so pro-health and education and the well-being of children. Children is the key word here. That I say this sort of in my own language. I'm not sure that every Hispanic would say this, but I say that for us, children are God, that we really see the face of God in children in our culture in a very deep and intense way. And that's important when people do want to come to us politically, come to us in nuanced ways. So recognize that. But Trump actually did that better than the Democrats did, that he had a prosperity initiative that he launched in Florida, that he reached out to Hispanic Texans around the oil industry, that he was nuanced in relating to us in ways that the Democrats weren't. I do want to say that we also have demographic change, that we also, have changes going on generationally. We completed a study recently on Latinx millennials that I can talk more about if people are interested in the questions. But Latinx millennial Christian leaders, we did the study out of Fuller, and they are just across the board more progressive, but their forms of church are changing. So if we talk about being nuanced and relating to different kinds of Hispanic religiosity, it's really important to recognize that there are new forms of church that are arising among our young people. So thank you.
Wonderful. Alexia, thank you so very much. Dr. Richard Flory, he's the Senior Director of Research and Evaluation, USC Center for Religion and Civic Culture, and one of my colleagues.
I've been tasked with 3 separate tasks, if that's possible. Talk about evangelicals, talk about religious nuns, and talk about youth. And I think all these intersect in different ways with the things that we've already heard this morning, not the least of which is, I love Yusuf's start to his presentation, it's not a monolith. And I think that is the lesson that we should all learn across the board, particularly with these groups, and certainly with evangelicals, although it certainly looks, the white evangelical vote and white evangelical political attitudes seem to be a monolith. So first of all, why are evangelicals important? This should be everybody should just assume this, because based on all of the press that white evangelicalism has gotten since Trump was elected. But essentially, evangelicals represent about a quarter of the US population. They were in 2020, 28% of the voters, and they do tend to vote at a high rate. But let's do a little definitional work here. First, what's an evangelical? I would refer you, and the link will go up on your screen, to CRCC's brief on American evangelicals, and we did it in the lead up to the 2018 midterm elections, and then we renewed it a little bit for the 2020 elections, called The Varieties of American Evangelicalism, just to highlight the difference within white evangelicalism, but also trying to take into account how it gets expressed by Latinx evangelicals, Asian evangelicals, et cetera. That's harder to parse out because there's not as much survey work done on the subgroups within evangelicalism. But in general, evangelicalism can be characterized by a belief in the literal truth of the Bible, having a, quote, personal relationship with Jesus, and on the importance of encouraging others to be born again in Jesus, lively church worship in church, and a moral code for their lives that's derived from their generally, although not completely, literal reading of the Bible. Now that, of course, plays out somewhat differently depending on who they are and where they are in terms of the moral code, whether personal or social, and how it's applied or interpreted in culture and society. But there is a shared religious theological base despite the differences. One definitional item I would like to add, and that is some particularly evangelical historians who study evangelicalism and a few others want to argue that evangelicalism as we understand it today relates to the pre-Civil War small e evangelical movement. I totally disagree with that. Most historians do. This is a new movement. It's new in the sense that it emerged in the early 20th century, and it emerged as a protest movement against the larger denominations. They were arguing for their own particular way of understanding the Bible and American culture. And so it's important to differentiate these. In fact, when the National Association of Evangelicals was founded, they framed themselves as Neoevangelicals. They were the new evangelicals. They were separate. They were different from the people that came before them. So now with that as definitional, let's think back to 2016 and what ended up being like the overwhelming support of white evangelical for Donald Trump, which everybody I knew was sort of stumped at, including myself. It was reported that 81% of white evangelicals voted for him. And it was surprising because mainly, let's just say that Donald Trump wasn't and isn't a model of the virtuous life that evangelicals have long promoted and required of the people they vote for. In fact, that was exactly the reasons they ignored for Donald Trump were exactly the reasons they were supporting Bill Clinton's impeachment. So there was some weird cognitive dissonance going on there, and probably still is in a lot of ways. But that was what they did. So the question going into the 2020 election was whether evangelicals would support Trump at the same level as in 2016. And there was, leading up to the election, there were some reports that maybe that support had slipped a little bit. Well, it turned out that it didn't slip a whole lot. So according to the things I've read, it's somewhere between 75, 76, somewhere in there. One report puts it back up at around 80% of evangelicals supported Trump in 2020. So it was similar, not exactly the same, but still a little bit surprising. But in the first several days after the election, I was following a Facebook thread, as everybody else was. And somebody said, and somebody reported the numbers, and somebody said in there, oh, well, at least it's moving in the right direction. And that turned on the little sociology brain light bulb in my head. And I said, well, is it? Is this really different? And so that sent me on a little internet search looking at exit polling data from past elections. And there's three basic trends that somebody with the energy and the ability to do this, I think a political scientist or historian should do this. There were like three trends that I picked up from just the polling data. First trend is evangelicals, this is the obvious one. Evangelicals have always voted in large majorities for Republican presidential candidates going back to 1960. And it's important to note here that going back that far, evangelicalism wasn't really a political category for people to think about and to talk about. That was just generally Protestant. So people that had done work in that's where I found those numbers, some numbers. They had to pull that out. It wasn't until the 70s, really, that evangelicalism becomes a political category with Jimmy Carter. The only exceptions to that were when a Democratic evangelical was on the ballot, such as Jimmy Carter, or a third-party candidate who was also an evangelical, such as John Anderson in 1980. And so Jimmy Carter splits a little bit of the evangelical vote. Evangelicals weren't really a political bloc at that point in time because the moral majority comes online in the wake of Jimmy Carter, really. And Reagan didn't really dominate in 1980. John Anderson pulled some votes away. Jimmy Carter was still on the ballot. And so it was still in flux at that time. Reagan received 60, I think he received just under 60% in 1980. And in 84, he received 69% of the vote. So it was an upward trend. The other exception is the presence of a more or less libertarian third-party candidate. Think Ross Perot and his little claw in 1992. And maybe Bill Clinton's identity as a church-going Christian could have had something to do with that as well. So it wasn't, so that's first trend. Second trend, since 1980, and that's Reagan and the rise of the religious right and Jerry Falwell and the moral majority and all of that apparatus, the percentage of support of evangelicals for Republican candidates has been on an upward trend. The exception is 92, as I sort of noted above, in terms of different ways that the vote might get split. And even with Mitt Romney in 2012, who was a prominent member of the LDS Church and should have been a problem for evangelicals theologically, he received 79% of the evangelical vote. But remember, Romney was running against Barack Obama, which probably had something to do with a large percentage of evangelical vote, because, as you know, evangelicals didn't really think that Obama wasn't Christian enough or American enough for them, and plus he was a Democrat. The third trend, and I think is the most interesting one, is the only two candidates from 1960 to 2016, that presented themselves in the most, quote, strongman or law and order manner, including implicit and explicit racist and race-baiting messaging, received more than 80% of the vote. Trump in 2016 and Richard Nixon, who received 84% in 1972. So that in itself, I think, is an interesting research project for somebody, not me. But I think what's the similarities between the late 60s and early 70s and where the time period we are now. Now, the last thought on evangelicals before I move on to religious nuns is that the important thing to think about for me, for evangelicals, is the institutional apparatus that they've built since the 1920s. There's more to the story than this, but essentially evangelicals hived themselves off from what we now call mainline Protestantism, created their own institutions, including schools, churches, publishing houses, other media outlets, legal associations, political organizations, and those all work to create a culture and a religious cultural worldview. And that's one reason why you have 80% of evangelicals that keep voting for somebody who might not fit the way that they think they should, because they get the messaging over and over and over again. The other angle on this, and I think it fuses into particularly the Latino and Asian world, population in terms of of those who are evangelicals. is that most of that original messaging comes from mission efforts from that early time, and then those Asian evangelicals, and that's really a bad category. It's much more specific than that. Latino, same thing as Alexia told us, but how that gets embodied within their own cultural context is important, but also how this larger white evangelical theological world influences that, continues to. Now, secondly, I got three things. Secondly, religious nuns. And first of all, what are religious nuns? It's basically, religious nuns got their name from survey response categories, where you get the big long list of what's your religion, and the bottom one says none of the above. And so somebody checks that off, and in the 1960s, a scholar said, we need to look at what the religious nuns actually mean. But it's become into more popular use lately, and it kind of includes everybody that's not religious, whether you're a dropout, whether you're an atheist, whether you're an agnostic, whether you just don't care, which is the biggest group of the religious nuns, is like, yeah, none of that applies to me. It's a bit more involved in that, and there might be a link that's being put up now. I wrote something about this a couple of years ago, just to sort of say, okay, here's the diversity. Again, there's this diversity question within people that don't believe. In a book we published a year ago, one respondent said, yeah, I don't call, this person was not religious, says, yeah, I don't call myself an atheist. That's just another way of saying you're religious, because it was so irrelevant to his life that he didn't even want to claim atheism as something that he cared about. But it's gotten, the nuns as a category have gotten a lot of attention over the last few years, mainly because of the rapid increase in the number. In 2007, it was about around, according to Pew, it was around 16% of the population, and that rose to about a quarter of the population by 2014. Among young people, the so-called millennials, and I don't like that categorization, but anyway, the younger people, it's about a third. And that's only increasing. That nuns tend to be more liberal and democratic. This is another angle of Janelle's comment about Democrats not focusing on immigrant minority populations soon enough in their campaigns. They also are not focusing on religious groups, and so that's so they tend to be more liberal, and I think that's where they see their base. 72% of nuns voted for Joe Biden, which is kind of the counter to white evangelicals voting for Donald Trump, although the numbers are different. And finally, the youth vote. And now I've written a lot about young people, but I pulled this data from Tufts University Circle Institute, I think is what it's called. And it was really fascinating to me, because things are shifting. And what I would have argued before the election going in was young people are going to turn out in low numbers as usual. They're not that interested in it. They don't really care about it. They're going to do their thing. But that's actually not true. In fact, and there's probably a lot of good reasons for this, but there's an increase from about 42 to 44% from 2016 of young people 18 to 29 that voted in 2016 to 52 to 55% of eligible voters age 18 to 29 that voted in 2020. That's a good sign of increase in turnout. 61% of young people voted for Biden. Donald Trump received 37%. Of those by race and ethnicity, the most telling ones, the white vote was fairly evenly split, 51 Biden, 49 Trump. But among African Americans, 87% for Biden, Asians, 83% for Biden, Latinos, 73% for Biden. There was a strong push for Biden among young people. And I think if you think back to the spring and all of the things that were going on in the spring with the social movement marches and things like that, that probably had a lot to do with that. On issues, there's several issues that they rated of who they thought would do it better, of who they voted for, what was important to them, from coronavirus to racism to climate change. And you've heard these numbers. What the most interesting one to me was whether abortion as a political issue was an important one to them. Of the young people, 18 to 29, who voted for Biden, 1% said abortion was an important issue for them. You would think that the young people, Trump voters, that would be a much higher vote level. No, only 9%. That I think is important because it suggests a break with the sort of culture wars mentality on a different level. And it sort of fits in with what work I've done before with other colleagues of mine, where these kinds of cultural war issues are different for young people. In fact, those are reasons for them to split from religion as opposed to staying within religious groups. So I think that that's all I have. I think the young people's vote is actually very interesting, and it cross cuts all the previous presentations. And I think it's the developing one that should frighten Republicans, because they're losing the youth vote.
Wow, this is really good. Thank you, Dr. Flory. This is amazing. Wonderful. Thank you, each of our panelists for this wonderful conversation, critical conversation for around election dissection. We've looked at what the results, as well as where we're going in the future. And I would add that, I think you said it, Flory, about all politics are local. And I really appreciate what you said, Dr. Alexia, about organizing, and Dr. Janelle about various places that we need to pay attention to, and Dr. Youssef around our youth and the civic skills. And so these are some really important points that I hope all of our listeners, all of you that are watching live and on Facebook, I hope that you're taking notes, because one thing we do know for sure, we all have to be engaged, all communities, and we all have to be listening to each other and paying attention to each other, so we can continue to build and do better as a nation. And so we don't continue to repeat some of the things in history that have adversely affected a number of communities. And let's continue the dialogue. This is the only way that we can do better and continue to move forward. And so finally, we want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today, and have a wonderful day and week. And thank you to all of our panelists today for this bold and dynamic conversation. Dr. Flory, Dr. Shaud, Dr. Salvatierra, Dr. Wong, and I am Reverend Najuma Smith-Pollard, a program manager at the Cecil Murray Center, and glad to be with you all today. Thank you so very much, and have a great day.